A warning before we start today. This episode includes allegations of sexual assault, and some listeners may find the details disturbing. Please take care.
On Friday morning, the judge in the sexual assault trial of 5 former members of Canada's 2018 World Junior Hockey Team announced that she was dismissing the jury. And, you could see some of the jurors physically look like they're shocked or shrug or shake their head.
Robyn Doolittle has been covering the trial for the Globe and Mail.
All the journalists who were sitting in the courtroom this morning knew that the moment was coming, and that didn't make the moment any less extraordinary.
This is the trial of Michael McLeod, Dylan Dubé, Carter Hart, Cal Foote, and Alex Formenton. Each has been charged with sexually assaulting a woman known as EM in June of 2018. McLeod also faces a second charge of being a party to sexual assault. All 5 men have pleaded not guilty. The alleged assault made national headlines a few years ago when TSN reported that Hockey Canada had quietly settled a multi-million-dollar lawsuit related to that night. Following public uproar, London police reopened their investigation and later charged the 5 players. The trial started late last month. In the weeks since, EM has given testimony, been cross-examined by multiple defense lawyers, and then faced re-examination by Crown prosecutors. Friday's jury dismissal is the second major interruption.
This whole saga has been stretching on for 7 years. We've been in this courtroom for 3 weeks. We already had a mistrial. We've been plagued by constant technical delays and concerns about the protests outside. And it's just been seemingly one thing after another. And it was, just one more thing in this already very tumultuous trial.
There has been a lot about this case that we have not been able to tell you. But now we can. Robyn Doolittle is a staff reporter with The Globe. She joins the show from London, Ontario. I'm Madeline White, in for Menaka Raman-Wilms, and this is The Decibel from the Globe and Mail. Hi, Robyn. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Hi, Maddie.
So you're actually joining me from outside of the courtroom in London. I really appreciate that. And we're speaking on Friday night. I wanted to just start by having you kind of walk us through what happened today in court.
What happened today is that the judge presiding over the sexual assault trial of 5 former members of Canada's 2018 World Junior Hockey Team has just dismissed a second jury in 3 weeks. She did not declare a mistrial, although that was on the table. I think it's worth noting a second mistrial was on the table, but the Crown, Megan Cunningham, sort of reluctantly agreed to a offer by the 5 different defense teams to proceed by judge alone. And the Crown's decision to do this will spare the complainant in the case, who is known publicly as EM, who, by the way, just spent 9 days in the witness box, including 7 really grueling days of cross-examination by 5 of the country's toughest defense lawyers. It will spare her from having to do this all over again, because that's what could have happened if we had to get a third jury.
Yeah. What prompted the judge's decision here to dismiss the jury?
So the fact that we are now a judge-alone trial means I can tell you this, and I can also tell you what caused the first mistrial.
And we are going to get into that.
So what happened today is the result of a note that one of the jurors passed the judge on Thursday, and jurors can communicate with the judge this way by giving them notes and asking questions, etc. And in that note, the juror said that multiple jurors were feeling essentially bullied by 2 of the defense attorneys. It was a pretty extraordinary claim. They specifically pointed the finger at Alex Formenton's lawyers. This is one of the accused players. And those lawyers are Daniel Brown and Hilary Dudding, who are both very experienced defense attorneys. And why don't I actually just read you the note that is at the subject of all of this?
Okay.
It says, multiple jury members feel we are being judged and made fun of by lawyers Brown and Hillary Detting. Every day when we enter the courtroom, they observe us, whisper to each other, and turn to each other and laugh as if they are discussing our appearance. This is unprofessional and unacceptable.
Wow.
Off the top, I should say that the two lawyers categorically denied that this is the case. They released a statement after this happened today, just pointing out that it would be very counterintuitive for the defense to alienate jurors. They called this an unfortunate misinterpretation of their actions. And they said, they found themselves involved in this unusual chain of events. It is, I guess, worth noting that the judge did say to the courtroom that she's been, watching everyone very closely and she's never seen anything inappropriate coming from the defense counsel. I think one of the suggestions, if you're taking into consideration that Dan Brown and Hillary Detting just categorically denied that they were making fun of the jurors, that they were giving them dirty looks or making fun of their clothing. At one point, Daniel Brown sort of suggested that the tone sort of shifted after his cross-examination and the media coverage that came with his cross-examination. Because I guess it's worth noting, Daniel Brown had one of the more intense cross-examinations of EM. Can
you quickly give me a sense of what you mean by that?
Like there was a couple of times where he had a comment, she was talking about feeling shame and embarrassment. And, he said something like shame and embarrassment for your choices or, it's never your fault. And, now these, 5 boys have to deal with the consequences of your choices. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but something like that. And the judge sort of cautioned, save that for your closing remarks, that this isn't appropriate at this time. He had a couple, I don't know how to describe them other than zingers that I think were on the more aggressive side of the cross-examinations.
Okay, so that's what the lawyers who are involved in this accusation are saying. But what happened after the judge learned of this situation?
There was a brief break. The defense attorneys discussed the situation amongst themselves and then came forward to the judge, not in the presence of the jury, and said, we need another mistrial. We cannot proceed. The jury is going to be biased against us. There's no reasonable way that our clients are going to be able to get a fair trial with what's happened. And there was some suggestion, by the Crown that perhaps there could be what's called an instruction to the jury. This is saying to the jury, I know that you might have felt this way. That's not what occurred. Put it out of your mind. And then also to do an inquiry where you could ask the jurors, is this going to impact your ability to be impartial? Because part of the question is, the note said multiple jurors, but was it 1? Was it 2? Was it more? Was it really just the one who's exaggerating? And I think part of the Crown's frustration was we have no idea because the judge did not conduct an inquiry.
Right.
What the judge found was that there's just no way to move forward and ensure the fairness of the trial, and that she was going to have to declare a second mistrial, which she realized was an extraordinary decision given we'd already have one and given we just had the complainant testimony. But she did offer that she would proceed with what's called a judge alone trial, which means just she's going to hear the rest of the case, no more juries. The defense so far, up to this point through all the proceedings, had wanted a jury, but the 5 different teams came together and said, okay, we'll do judge alone. And the Crown actually opposed to that decision, saying, respectfully, we've presented so much of our key evidence and we've been presenting it in the way that we would for a jury trial. If we had known this was going to be judge alone, we would have handled things differently. She didn't elaborate what that could be, but having watched the trial, I can think of things like perhaps the Crown would have objected more during the cross-examination of EM. There's always a balance that lawyers have to make in front of a jury because you don't want to be unlikable for this very reason we're discussing.
Right.
So we don't exactly know what she was referring to, but she said, okay, we can proceed by judge alone. So that's what happened.
So what are the consequences of becoming a judge alone trial?
I mean, a whole bunch of things are going to be different now moving forward. But for us, the reporters who are covering the case, the big change is that one of the major publication bans is lifted. There's always a standard publication ban in these types of cases where anything that happens in court that doesn't happen in front of the jury cannot be reported on, which is why we couldn't explain what caused the first mistrial. But now that we're judge alone, everything that came up in the pretrial hearings, when just the lawyers were doing legal negotiations or arguments, all of that can now come out. We're free to report on it.
We'll be right back. Okay, so in the instance that happened on Friday, it is the second time in this case that the judge has had to dismiss the jury. So let's talk about the first time now, Robyn. What happened during that instance?
So the trial got underway on April 23rd. I was here that day. There was tons of media, huge anticipation, obviously. We went through jury selection. The players entered their plea of not guilty. The Wednesday morning we start. Crown gets up after the break at some point, does their opening remarks. They're laying out their roadmap of what they say they're going to prove in this case. We go on the lunch break, and when we come back, before the jury is called back into the room, the judge tells the courtroom, the lawyers, the people watching, although we can't report on any of this at the time, that something occurred over the lunch break. One of the jurors says that they were approached by one of the defense counsel, who we know is now Hilary Dudding, at a market very close to the courthouse, and that they felt it was inappropriate. And this is, a huge situation. We've just started. And I think it's also significant that this is day one. And as they're leaving, that the juries always get kind of the same instructions from the judge. You are not supposed to discuss this case with anyone. You shouldn't be reading any media articles about the case. You're only supposed to know what's happening in the courtroom. Don't talk to anybody who's in this courtroom, just a kind of a standard charge. And I think one of the jurors took this really, really seriously. What we found out, because the judge called the juror in for an interview, and ultimately the defense team involved made a statement about what happened. And what we understand, there's two different versions of events. The juror says that they're in line trying to get their lunch at this local food market. I think it's also worth noting here that the area of London where we are, it's quite small. There's very few places to go. I have frequently been seeing the judge outside, the jurors walking around, defense counsel, you're next to the accused players in the hallways, the elevator. Like, it's very crammed. There's few places to eat. So the market is a very popular destination. And so the lawyer is standing in line and the juror's behind her. And the juror says that the lawyer essentially approaches her and says, there's a lot of head nodding going on this morning. And the juror, who's been told not to say anything to anybody, looks at her, nods, says nothing. She then gets her lunch, goes and sits down with another juror and says, someone from the court just approached me. The other juror says, oh my gosh, what'd they say? That seems inappropriate. The two of them get back to the court, and then we find out they sort of tell everyone about what's happened here. The second juror tells the sheriff, and then someone else hears, and soon all the jurors are discussing this, air quotes, inappropriate interaction that happened at the market. In the defense attorney's version of events, she's waiting to get lunch and sort of bumps into the person behind her. She turns, realizes it's a juror, says, oh my gosh, sorry, or awkward, or something to that effect. She called it, a reflexive reaction, sort of, closes her mouth, kind of nods, and then proceeds to get her food and goes back to court and doesn't think anything of it. So we hear these two different versions of events, and the judge, she seems to accept Hilary Dudding's version, but it's, what's done is done. The jurors believe this is true, and they all have been talking about it, and they all believe that the defense counsel can't follow the rules and has been acting inappropriately right before the trial even starts, and that this is going to impact their ability to judge the case fairly because they think that the defense is breaking the rules.
And so just to be clear, though, this is one of the same lawyers, right? Because in the instance that happened on Friday, the accusation of bullying was against the lawyers of Alex Formenton, Daniel Brown, and Hillary Dunning. And then this issue with the lunch lineup bump-in and the dispute over exactly what happened there, that is also Hillary Dunning. Is that right?
It is.
Robyn, for those who haven't been following the trial, could you give us a sense of the case and what's alleged on either side?
So just to really quickly summarize what her version of events are, it's essentially on June 18, 2018, EM goes to a bar in downtown London called Jack's with some coworkers. And they're drinking, they're dancing. She bumps into some of the players of the 2018 World Junior Hockey team who are in town celebrating their gold medal win at the World Championships. After this big Hockey Canada gala ends, the players come to Jack's. That's where she meets them. She and one of the players, Mike McLeod, spend much of the night together, and they eventually leave together and have consensual sex at his hotel, which is nearby. It's called the Delta Armories. She alleges that when they finished, he began inviting teammates to the room without her knowledge, and that when they started showing up, she was shocked, she was scared, and she ultimately says that she did whatever they said for the next couple of hours because she felt she had no choice. And she alleges that they, ordered her to do various sexual acts, that they, threatened to put a golf club inside of her and various other things. She says that she, went into autopilot and went numb and was just doing whatever she could to get through the night. She's also testified, though, that she was crying at times and that the players saw her crying and that she tried to leave, but they convinced her to stay. The defense attorneys, when they got up, basically said this is not at all what happened, that she was the one, after she had consensual sex with Michael McLeod, that said, why don't you invite your friends from the bar to the room and we'll have a, quote, wild night. And that she was the one that initiated the sexual activity, and that when the men started arriving, she was saying things like, come have sex with me. And we've now heard testimony from one man who was in the room who, has not been charged, who said that, yeah, that's what happened. We've also heard testimony that the players had a group chat after the fact where they said, we've got to get our story straight. They also said things like, though, we got consent, there's no problem here, but, let's just all say the same thing. So it's a messy case from top to bottom.
Yeah. And of course, at the center of this trial is the question of consent.
I think the thing with consent is that very few people have an understanding of what it actually means in a legal sense in Canada. I think, when you might remember being a teenager and hearing, no means no. It used to be the law that women had to show physical signs of trying to resist. There had to be ripped clothing and scratches for resistance to happen. And when, in fact, the law of consent it's not about saying no, it's indicating yes. And it doesn't have to be a verbal indication, but it has to be an indication. Right. And then consent also has to happen in the moment of the sexual activity. You can't give consent before, you can't give consent after, and it has to be for each sexual act. So you can't, just because you might consent to, say, have oral sex at 10 p.m., at 11 p.m., that doesn't mean that you can't withdraw consent to have vaginal sex, or et cetera, et cetera. So all of those issues will be very much live in this case. So
before I let you go here, Robyn, what do we know about what happens next in this trial?
I am so hesitant to make any prediction in this trial because it just seems like who even knows, but I think we can expect to hear, from some more players. I think a big question will be whether the accused players testify in their own defense. They do not have to. The burden of proof on this is on the Crown entirely. The players have the weight of the state against them. They have pleaded not guilty, but they do have that option. We're going to hear from police investigators as well because there's been many investigations, right? There was two police investigations. There was a Hockey Canada investigation. And the fact that it's now judge alone, lots of things could change, because the difference between a jury and a judge is that the judge knows the law and they have been trained to be able to put things out of their mind that maybe might be emotionally appealing, but that doesn't fit with the facts. Whereas juries are much more susceptible to their gut as opposed to the facts. So I think that we don't really know what's going to happen next.
Well, Robyn, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
That was Robyn Doolittle, a staff reporter with The Globe. That's it for today. I'm Madeline White, in for Menaka Raman-Wilms. Our intern is Kelsey Howlett. Aja Souter is our associate producer. I produced The Decibel with Michal Stein and Allie Graham. Tiff Lamb helped with this episode. David Crosby edits the show. Adrian Chung is our senior producer, and Matt Frainer is our managing editor. Thank you for listening.